I'm Linda Baker, the Learning Director at the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children. On behalf of the Learning Network and Knowledge Hub teams, welcome to the second webinar of our 2022-23 lineup, Unraveling the Complexities of Domestic Violence and Criminalization in Black Women's Lives. I'm located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenapehoik, and the Attawandaron peoples. These lands are connected with the London Township and Sombra treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. Today is National Indigenous Peoples Day. Whatever traditional territory you may be located on, it is a day for us to recognize, to remember, to honor, and to celebrate the unique heritage, diverse cultures, strength, and outstanding contributions of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I'm honored to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Patrina Duhaney. Dr. Patrina Duhaney is a critical race scholar and social work activist in the Faculty of Social Work at the University of Calgary. Her research grapples with issues related to race, racism, the intersections between victimization and criminalization, and is informed by critical race theory, critical race feminism, and anti-racism. Dr. Duhaney has over 14 years of experience working as a social worker, counselor, and frontline worker with diverse populations, including women who experience domestic violence and individuals in conflict with the law. Dr. Duhaney is actively involved in various initiatives within the university and across various communities to help forefront Black people's experiences and perspectives and confront anti-Black racism. Welcome, Dr. Patrina Duhaney.
Thank you so much for the introductions. Really appreciate it. Good afternoon, everyone. It's so nice to see so many of you online, and I imagine a number of folks will be joining us shortly as well. Thank you so much for joining in the conversation on unraveling the complexities of domestic violence and criminalization in Black women's lives. Your presence reinforces the need to create space for more discussions that center Black women's experiences. By creating space for these types of conversations, we send a clear message that Black women's voices and experiences have merit. And hopefully encourages Black women to come forward and break their silence on the myriad forms of violence in their lives. I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that I am speaking to you from the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in Southern Alberta. I'm committed to working collaboratively with Indigenous peoples and communities to respectfully honor their histories, worldviews, experiences, while doing my part to help redress the violence, mass violence, in fact, inflicted upon them. As today is National Indigenous Peoples Day, it is an excellent opportunity to learn more about Indigenous peoples' rich history. I am grateful to my ancestors, Black leaders and advocates who have paved the way for me so that I can be here today to advocate for change and advance equity for Black women and Black communities. I am indebted to the Black women who have spoken with me and will speak to me about their experiences of domestic violence and with the police. It's because they have shared their stories and experiences that I've been able to gain knowledge and insights and can humbly represent their stories today. 13 years ago, I realized little was known about Black women who were both victimized and criminalized. I had to rely extensively on US data because this data was nearly non-existent in Canada. The same was true for shelters for abused women. As a frontline worker, I noticed that they were using Eurocentric approaches and intervention, and this was applied universally to all women, despite their social location. I made a commitment at that time that I wanted to contribute to that sparse scholarship in this area. And so I spent the last 13 years conducting research that specifically looks at the overlap between Black women's victimization and criminalization. Certainly in recent years, we've seen an uptick in conversations about Black women's experiences of domestic violence and with the police. The Black Lives Matter movement, along with the COVID pandemic, emphasized the ways in which Black people are disproportionately impacted by violence and subsequent neglect. These inequities have led to an urgent call demanding that we critically examine the disproportionate number of Black people impacted by all forms of violence. For our conversation this afternoon, I will share the ways in which I conceptualize the concepts victimized and criminalized. While Black women may assume the identities of victim and survivor simultaneously and at different times in their lives, I use these terms, for example, victimized, to characterize the intersecting and overlapping forms of violence Black women experience, which includes domestic violence, institutional violence, structural violence, and community violence. I use the term criminalized to characterize the violence that Black women may engage in, and I'll complicate that piece shortly. I concur with Comack and Bricky, who argue that using the term criminalized allows me to place Black women's violence within the context within which it occurs. It does not excuse the behavior, but it does assist in making it more understandable, especially in terms of the choices these women have available to them. The term criminalized also allows me to interrogate the ways in which the criminal justice system is implicated in violence against Black women and how these Black women are severely penalized for their actions. As I move through my presentation, I will be drawn from my own research in the field, as well as the research of key scholars and advocates who are advancing research on Black women's experiences of domestic violence and with the police. There will be several activities, matter of fact, 3, that I'm hoping that you will be actively engaged in, and I will certainly prompt you when it is time to do so. This conversation that we're having today is not intended to negate the experiences of trans women or women who do not conform to cisgendered ideologies. However, my research focuses primarily on Black women in heterosexual relationships. Nonetheless, much of what I discuss today will certainly have relevance to Black individuals whose identities are fluid. I hope that beyond today, other organizations and those of you who are listening to this webinar will create additional space for these types of conversations that aim to elevate Black women and combat violence in all its forms. So there are a number of learning objectives for today. I'm going to identify 3. By the end of this webinar, you should have an increased awareness of the unique challenges Black women face, who are both victimized and criminalized. You should be able to identify the impacts of various pejorative stereotypes and the stigma associated with violence in Black families and communities, and how these compound their experiences. And I want you to be able to know how you can help mitigate these forms of violence. You will also be able to identify ways in which you can support Black women through the use of accessible and practical tools, as well as healing modalities. So before I jump into the first activity, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about who I am. I know that we provided some information previously about me, but I will elaborate a little bit more on this, all right? So the act of situating and locating myself into this conversation helps me to discuss the ways I am positioned in relation to this topic that looks at Black women's experiences. As a Black woman myself, an educator, a researcher, a scholar, and an activist, I have experienced racism in various settings, different forms of oppression, which in fact inform the way I make sense, interact with, and respond to my environment and the people I encounter. I recognize that I navigate spaces that often minimize, deny, and misconstrue Black people's experiences and histories. And so my positionality as a Black person helps me construct and act upon these realities to disrupt and break down barriers for Black individuals. So we're gonna engage in a fun activity just to get us all warmed up. The first activity, what you're asked to do is name what comes to mind when you think of a Black woman who has experienced and perpetrated violence in her relationship. And so there should be a link. You are asked to go to slido.com and please enter the following code, 6437513. So I'll give you a chance to go to slido.com and please enter the following code when prompted to do so, 6437513. And some of you are on top of that and you are entering that already. And so folks will certainly see as this is populating what folks are saying. Thank you so much for doing that. So there are a few things that certainly come to people's minds. They think of generational trauma, they think about vulnerability, they think about the ways in which this person is entrapped, they think of self-defense, what happened to her, they think of the ways in which she might be over-criminalized. Some people think of intersectionality. Trauma is really big here. We have an informed audience here. We think of people who might be strong, a woman who's strong, but also that vulnerability. There's a piece around superwoman, a person who might be wounded, scared. Certainly quite a few things come to mind. Systemic racism, all the layers in which Black women may experience that violence. One person said sad. The cycle of violence certainly comes to mind. Thank you so much. So continue populating that. And as you are putting that word that comes to mind, please remember this, because we will certainly be referring to that as we go through this conversation. Fear, poverty, racism, overwhelmed. Some of you think about children as well. Angry, the angry Black women stereotype, definitely. Trauma is certainly a factor here. All right, I'll wait a couple more minutes and then we will move on to the next slide. This is really fun when I see folks engaging. Awesome, awesome, thank you. Let's try and fill up as much of that white space as possible. I think there are quite a few of you online, so we certainly have an opportunity to do so. Again, slido.com, the number is 6437513. All right, so we're just gonna move on. Don't forget, you can continue participating in this exercise, because I will certainly be referring back to it afterwards, all right? All right, so when I look at this image, certainly I see images that often saturate social media, saturate the internet, and what I'm seeing here in front of me are all white women. And oftentimes that seems like that's the reality in domestic violence sector. So the experiences of white women and white men saturate, as I mentioned, the domestic violence sector. It also saturates research and practice and even the interventions that women might have available to them. Service providers are predominantly white. Just take a look at professional websites and to see who is out there providing these types of services. These images, however, often characterize white women as passive, helpless, in need of protection, but they're often depicted as well as a worthy victim. But what happens when we don't consider the realities of other women? What gets lost? Let's unpack that a little bit further, okay? Black women are overlooked. They are disenfranchised. Because Black women are oftentimes not afforded the same recognition for their victimization as white women, they are more likely to be viewed as culpable for the abuse they experience and are, they're considered to be able to protect themselves or expected to protect themselves, right? Even the Me Too movement, from the previous slide, what you can see is that even the Me Too movement focuses predominantly on white women, despite the fact that it was created by a Black woman, Tarana Burke. And despite the work that she has done to bring attention to the experiences of all women and their vulnerability of sexual violence, she herself maintains that we are socialized to respond to the vulnerability of white women, although there is ample evidence that substantiates this claim. People have a hard time accepting this and are uncomfortable discussing how white women continue to be the focus of discussions. So I thought it was really necessary to set the context of why I continue to do this work. So I'm not going to give you a definition per se of domestic violence, but I think it's really important for you to understand the ways in which I use domestic violence. And so generally, we know that domestic violence could be understood as a pattern of behavior, tactics and actions that are both subtle and overt, and are used by individuals in their intimate relationships to maintain power and control over another person. In my work, I use intimate partner violence, intimate partner abuse, domestic violence, gender-based violence interchangeably. In my more recent work, I use intimate partner violence. Certainly, we see different concepts being used by different individuals depending on the relevance of those terms for them. But as I mentioned, I'll certainly be using these terms in the context of heterosexual relationships. So what is known about Black women experiences of violence in Canada? So historically, the government of Canada, in fact, Statistics Canada has not historically collected disaggregated race-based data on domestic violence that speaks to the differential experiences of women from different racial and ethnic backgrounds, with the exception of Indigenous women, all right? Stats Canada and other areas of government continue to use the outdated term of visible minority, which often homogenizes women's experiences and obscures their unique realities. So I was quite happy, a matter of fact, excited to see data released in 2021 by Stats Canada titled Intimate Partner Violence, Experiences of Visible Minority Women in Canada, 2018. So we're looking at data from 2018, but this was released recently, just last year. And from that data, we know that Black women, at least 42%, were likely to experience domestic violence. And they use the term IPV, intimate partner violence, when compared to their white counterparts. Latin American women experience slightly higher prevalence of IPV, according to this study. And so they were looking at, specifically physical and sexual assault over the lifetime. This data also revealed that Black women and other racialized women were likely, more likely to experience barriers and access to services. So it was really surprising when I read further, and the data said that there's no real, statistic significance in self-reported impacts and consequences of domestic violence, which certainly contradicts other research, especially in the US, that shows that the impact and consequences of domestic violence in Black women's lives are different. it's exacerbated based on their intersecting identities. Certainly, this study that I alluded to is a move in the right direction. However, there is need for more population-based studies conducted by the government that critically examines and analyzes the differences across ethnocultural groups in various categories based on age, race, gender, class, education, immigration status, and so forth. So let's go a little bit deeper about the violence that Black women experience. What does that look like? So domestic violence in Black women's lives is seldom an isolated event. Their marginalization increases the risk for a variety of violent and traumatic experiences. So to understand the complexities of violence in Black women's lives, we must examine how multiple forms of violence, which I've highlighted here, intersect to shape their experiences. So let's look at these. Let's just name a few here. Certainly, we see domestic violence, but there's also cultural violence, institutional violence, structural violence, and community violence. And so when I think of historical violence, which should be here, I am thinking of, I'm referring here to that collective, spiritual, psychological, emotional, cognitive distress and violence perpetrated intergenerationally. And this could be derived from Black people's denigrated experiences of slavery and the continued patterns of racism and discrimination. So we look at racial trauma as well, and the ways in which that has that psychological, emotional, and physical injury for Black women. It is important to know, although I'm talking about that racial trauma piece, this is not a singular event that happens at one time. It's something that has happened over a long period of time. This prolonged exposure that alters the trajectory, not only for Black women, but their communities across generations. We can see the impact of historical and racial violence in the disempowerment of Black people today. We see the disproportionate levels of poverty, how they are economically disadvantaged. We see a breakdown in the traditional family structure, displacement, social change, forced family separation, forced assimilation, and loss of culture. And this can certainly lead to inadequate parenting skills, strained parent-child relationships, and intergenerational cycles of partner and child abuse. But what role does culture play? Being a part of a culture that justifies and legitimizes violence against women certainly has deleterious effects. And we certainly see aspects of cultural violence permeated in all of these forms of violence I have identified here. When we think of how institutions are implicated in violence against women, we can look at the healthcare system, we can look at the criminal justice system, child welfare system, education system, and the barriers these various systems create for Black women. So just for an example, when we think of institutional violence, how Black women are disproportionately criminalized. And this positions them in a dangerous situation. State-sanctioned violence converge in Black women's lives in ways that further complicate their experiences of domestic violence. When we think of community violence, what role does that play? And so certainly if you listen to the news, if you are on social media, if you read various media outlets or access various media outlets, you can see the ways in which Black people are disproportionately impacted by violence. And whether it's witnessing, experiencing homicide, gun violence, assaults, robberies, those certainly impact Black individuals, whether they are either the victims or they're the perpetrators of violence. And we can certainly see how the COVID pandemic has exacerbated Black women's experiences of violence and the deleterious effects this has had in their lives, their health, safety, and access to resources. So one of the things I think it's important to do is talk about the overlap between women's victimization and criminalization. Oftentimes in society, we look at these concepts, as I mentioned earlier, in binary terms. Women are either victims or they're either offenders, and the way they are constructed in the criminal justice system is certainly problematic. There is certainly little discourse and conversations around how women who do not fit nicely in these boxes, what supports are actually available to these women. So it's really important for us to look at discourses that are not binary. Women are either victims or perpetrators, right? So I'll unpack that in just a moment. But before I go further, I have another activity for you. And so again, it's the same website, slido.com. You are using the same code. Because this is live, you should be able to see the next activity that pops up on your end. And so in this exercise, you're asked to tell me what resources you believe Black women who are victimized and criminalized are more likely to use. And when you click on that link and enter that code, you will have a number of different options. You will have counseling, you'll have domestic violence shelter, a family member, a friend, a coworker, police or criminal justice system, and folks are starting to complete that. And so again, you'll have a few minutes to capture your responses there. And I'm really curious to see what folks believe are the resources Black women are more likely to access. So continue putting your responses down, and then we will see how this is moving along. So right now, folks are saying Black individuals, particularly Black women who are victimized and criminalized, are more likely to turn to their friends or a family member. And a few of you believe that some of the services Black women are willing to access would be domestic violence shelter, a coworker, or counseling services. Let's see how the police is doing. Okay. all right, or the criminal justice system. All right, so I'll give you a couple more minutes for those who are still entering their responses, and then we will continue from there. Once again, thank you for engaging in this exercise. It's really nice when we can do these interactive exercises. All right. So don't be shy, folks. If you still want to participate in the poll, it is still active. I see just over 300 people who have participated in the poll. Go ahead and complete your responses, and we will continue. All right, so just to recap what I'm seeing here, you are doing an excellent job when you think of the services and supports Black women are more likely to utilize. And I will certainly be touching on these momentarily, but I just wanted to know what folks were thinking in terms of their perspectives on the resources Black women may or are more likely to utilize. So keep a mental note of this in your head, okay? So we're just gonna move on. Know that even after I switch, you will be able to still complete that exercise, and we will recap these responses again, all right? All right, so let's unpack some risk factors, and then we'll go into those resources and interventions that are available to Black women. Okay, so when we think of risk factors, I think it'll be important for me here to share with you some of the findings from my own research. So I conducted research that looked at Black women's experiences who actually experienced domestic violence, but were either charged with perpetrating, were also charged with perpetrating violence in their relationships. And so the findings I'm presenting here is consistent with my research and those from other studies as well. Okay, and certainly we'll see an overlap between the typical victim and what we know of Black women's experiences, okay? So from my own research and also from scholarship that looks at Black women's experiences of domestic violence, we know that various forms of violence are constantly at play in Black women's lives, okay? And so Black women may have a history of childhood violence. They may also have a history of violence in their in a previous relationship as well as a current relationship. And so from what we know, the extent in which they are experiencing these various forms of violence actually increase their risk of further violence in their subsequent relationships or later in their lives, okay? Then we look at poverty. Poverty certainly plays a role in Black women's experiences of domestic violence. And research has shown a link between poverty and domestic violence. And so, a caveat to what I'm saying is that Black women are not necessarily more predisposed, or people who experience poverty are not necessarily more predisposed to violence, but they are more at risk of experiencing domestic violence, okay? And so we know that poverty entraps women. It exacerbates the impact, their lack of resources to safely lead an abusive relationship, all right? We also know that immigration status and women's precarious position in terms of their immigration certainly creates an additional risk. And so their partners might use a number of power and control tactics to get women to stay in that abusive relationship. Women might fear that their partners may withdraw sponsorship. They might have language barriers, right? They might not know the dominant, language, whether French or English, and even know how to access resources that are available to them, especially if they're new to the country. We also see the ways in which systemic, so substance use might also impact women's experiences of domestic violence. So for example, in my own research, if each partner, so the women or the men, were using substances, whether it's alcohol or drugs in their relationship, it certainly impacted the frequency and severity, lethality of violence in their relationships. Then there's another piece here in terms of risk factor. We see systemic racism. And so, and I'm referring to racism in all aspects of Black women's lives. And that impacts the extent to which they are actually comfortable to share their experiences. A fear that they might not be believed or taken seriously, or actually treated more harshly when they report these experiences to more formal supports. But there are two areas I really want to focus in on, is this whole concept of racial loyalty. And when I talk about racial loyalty and the stereotypical images of Black women, I want you to make that link back to systemic racism, okay? Because that certainly, systemic racism informs these two areas, racial loyalty and stereotypical images. And so when I talk about racial loyalty, Black women may be more loyal to their partners because of their experiences of racism. They have been taught through generations that they need to really protect Black individuals and their partners because of the discrimination and racism they might experience in society, okay? And so that racial loyalty, making that connection back to systemic racism, Black women who see and experience police violence and brutality in their communities, and they see and witness the over surveillance and over criminalization in Black communities, are more reluctant to report the abuse that they may experience, for fear that they may experience more discrimination or racism, or there might be that assumption that Black communities are predisposed to criminality, right? So there are all these different factors that impact Black women's, willingness to be loyal to their partners as opposed to reporting that abuse. Then we also have stereotypes of Black women, and certainly there are so many stereotypes, negative stereotypes. We hear some that are positive as well, such as strong, right? Resilient. But let's unpack those negative ones, and I'll come back to those other stereotypes, those positive stereotypes. So more so than other times, Black women are depicted as argumentative, aggressive, confrontational, and more likely to provoke their partner. Black women may not be seen as less credible victims. And because of that, violence might be used, violence might be normalized against Black women. Stereotypical images of Black women, specifically negative stereotypical images of Black women, impact not only how Black communities might respond to Black women who experience domestic violence, but how institutions might respond to them as well. Members of Black communities may also reinforce these stereotypes against Black women. So hopefully that gives you some context when we unpack the overlapping forms of violence in Black women's lives. So if we were to take, think about what you mentioned earlier in that activity number 2 that I shared with you was what are some responses? What are responses to violence that Black women often engage in? And if we think of those previous slides and what people said, you mentioned that Black women were more likely to utilize family and friends. And so, in fact, as consistent with my own research and other research, certainly, I found that Black women were more likely to use informal support, such as family and friends, okay? But I also found that sometimes family members were encouraging Black women to stay in that abusive situation for fear of, remember what I mentioned, that systemic racism, for fear that they might be treated more harshly when they reported that harm that they experience, all right, or their partners might be more subjected to harsh treatments. But certainly, Black women use formal supports as well, such as counseling services. They might be, they might be reporting their experiences of domestic violence to counselors and the members of the criminal justice system, such as police and so forth. But I also saw that Black women a lot were just focusing on ways that they could cope with the abuse that they were experiencing. And so they engaged in a number of different activities to either ignore that abuse, not take it seriously, right? Or not just find ways to manage that on their own. But there were a few women who engaged in verbal and physical resistance and use of force. And the criminal justice system uses the words, retaliation and violence and so forth. But I want to challenge us to think more critically of using the term violence, because it's not always violent. And oftentimes when women use physical resistance in their relationship, they may feel that they might not have any other options but to engage in that behavior. Because if you think back on what I said, Black women are expected to be strong. They are expected to be able to hold the front, manage things on their own. So that's problematic. That's certainly problematic because Black women who do not conform to this strong stereotype might not even get that support that they need. So let's unpack this. We have a bit more time. I'll just spend another 8 minutes or so before I open things up for questions. But how can we support Black women? Given the information I've shared with you, what are some things that we need to be cognizant of? Okay, so there are a number of healing approaches and modalities that are used to support Black women. And there are some themes that these approaches may utilize. And so let's look at those. So any approaches or interventions that are being utilized must look at the ways in which violence have impacted Black communities across generations. So think back on the slides I mentioned, the ways in which historical, racial violence and so forth intersect in Black women's lives. So any intervention that are being utilized must look at racial trauma, right? And how racial trauma impacts Black women. Another reoccurring theme in the scholarship and what I found with Black women in my study was the use of religious and faith-based institutions. And so historically, Black people have relied on their faith to get them through a number of hardships and obstacles in their lives. And so it's really important that attention is paid to the ways in which faith-based institutions can support Black women, because it's certainly a source of strength and inspiration and aspiration for Black women. It allows them to cope with life challenges, violence, illness, poverty, and so forth. And so I would encourage practitioners to be open to exploring different spiritual modalities that might be relevant to Black women. It's really possible, certainly possible, that practitioners might not feel comfortable having these conversations with Black women about their religion or their spirituality. So it's really important that as frontline workers, practitioners, service providers, that you consult with religious leaders or traditional healers for guidance and as a potential source of referral. Certainly, we hear about the strengths-based approach, empowerment approach. I think folks have a good idea of what that is. So I won't really go deep into that. But it's also during these conversations when we talk about ways in which we can empower Black women that we think of this concept of resilience, okay? And so resilience can be understood as a process through which one is able to successfully adapt to adversity, trauma, or significant stressors in their lives. And however, the conventional definitions of resilience are often individualistic, and they're based on Western and Eurocentric perspectives, and often dichotomize resilience. People either have it or they don't. So these conceptualizations, I'm not saying don't use strengths-based approaches or empowerment approaches, but it's really important to know the context within which it is these approaches are being used. Okay, so by focusing, for example, on a person's ability to be resilient or not resilient, they may be blamed for their own oppression, and social inequality is reinforced. So conversations must move beyond resiliency and steps must be taken to embed and integrate policy changes that interrupt the cycles of unemployment, violence, incarceration, poverty, and isolation. So just a note on that. Other interventions that could be used would be like healing tools. And so with my own theoretical positionality, I use critical race theory with a lot of what I do. And there's this notion of counter storytelling. And so it's really important that Black women have a way to counter the negative and dominant stereotypes that inform their experiences. There could be art, music, literature, and poetry. And so it's really important that there are different approaches that are used, and there's creativity as well in these approaches. But we see the importance of preventative education as well. Okay, and so most DV interventions place the onus on women to eradicate violence in their lives as if they're the ones who created that violence in their lives. And so I'm encouraging organizations to focus more on ways in which men can be engaged to better understand their role in eradicating domestic violence and preventing it so that they can actually truly effect change. there's this piece around advocacy and social justice. It's really important that there are systems in place that support women so that they can know the ways in which the system is working for them and not necessarily against them. And so I would encourage organizations to really advocate for change and really advance social justice approaches. And so there are a few things that I want to summarize, because I want to give us an opportunity to folks an opportunity to ask questions. And so when I think of the work that I've done over the years and just what I've seen in the scholarship, what I want to say is, let's be real, folks, okay? There are just too many agencies and practitioners engaging in what we call performative allyship, all right? And so professing to support Black women and, expressing this solidarity. However, this support is often superficial. And so I'm just going to call it for what it is, right? And so if organizations are truly invested in seeing changes and are serious about making changes and eradicating violence in Black communities, they really need to be invested and commit the time, the effort, and energy to truly bring about real change for Black individuals. And so thinking back on all what I've said, it's really important for us to move beyond these binary notions of victim and offender that takes a static, singular approach. These terms, what I want you to remember is that these terms are fluid. And women might not fit nicely in one term or another. A woman might certainly fit nicely in both categories. Okay, so it's really important for us to move beyond those dichotomous classifications. All right, Black women are not helpless or incapable victims. As I mentioned before, they have not necessarily been awarded that status. So they have had to move beyond those terms as well. As I mentioned previously, historically, Black women have not been considered the credible victim. And so oftentimes they may believe that they can't rely on the system to protect them. So I certainly see that we have significant work to do to change that narrative, and so that Black women know that we truly care. Right? We need to ensure that Black women know that we truly care for them. And so, although I talked about Black women may use force in their relationships, oftentimes they are using force in their relationships in response to their partner's violence. Okay, research shows us that women are more likely to be victims of domestic violence than their male counterparts. Although there is some other research that shows that women are just as violent as their male counterparts. Let's debunk that, because women continue to primarily be victims in their relationships. All right. And so the other thing I want to highlight is the role race plays in engaging with women. And so in my own research, I saw that my racial identity, my racial and gendered identity allowed me to engage with Black women. And what I'm saying here is that organizations need to do a better job of hiring Black counselors, Black therapists, Black frontline workers to engage with these women to help break down barriers. And don't just stop there. It's really important that organizations have folks in managerial positions and positions of power to bring about policy and systemic changes within organizations as well. It's really important that when Black women access services, that they know that they will be heard. They will be taken seriously. They will be believed. Okay, it's really important as well that appropriate training is provided for practitioners so that they can provide Black women with the quality services that they deserve. And if you are not there yet as an organization, it's really important while you're working on that piece that you are aware of those resources that exist for Black women, and you can make an appropriate referral. It's really important, as the previous slides, that organizations need to invest in preventative approaches, right? Not supporting women only when they come to see organizations, but what can be done in the school systems, right? What services and supports can be provided so that Black women know that they have other options in their lives. It's really important to understand the role pejorative stereotypes play and know how that might impact one's experiences of the ways in which you might engage with Black families, Black women, how those might come out in those interactions, and how you might even respond to concerns that they may share with you. So just a few points there, and I'm going to turn now to activity 3 before we wrap things up. And so for this activity, that social justice piece that I told you about, you are implicated in this discussion. So what I'm asking folks to do here, that same link that you have here, slido.com, 6437513. What you're asked to do is discuss how will you use the knowledge you have gained today. And so thought it would be easier to just plug things in here to give you some options here in terms of what you feel. And I believe I've given folks multiple options, so you can certainly select 1 or 2 options if you feel that it might be limited to just have 1 option. So here you're asked to consider, will you share your knowledge with others? Okay, will you engage in self-reflection? Some might want to apply the strategies and approaches that they have learned to their own practice. Some might seek out other learning opportunities, because as I mentioned, this discussion is just scratching the surface. We need to really expand our knowledge further and learn more, all right? Others may enhance their knowledge by reading relevant information on Black women. Since the Black Lives Matter movement, I have certainly seen an increase in webinars and a scholarship that focuses on Black women's experiences, not only with domestic violence, but with the police. Some might be keen on applying strategies and approaches that they have learned to their own practice. Others might feel the need to seek out other learning opportunities. And some might enhance their knowledge by reading relevant information on Black women. Some might feel the need to change their behaviors and perceptions of Black women. And folks, this is key. This is key, all right? And we might not think we have any biases and so forth, but we can't do any of these things if we don't check ourselves first and see what biases and stereotypes we might hold about how we might perceive Black women or Black communities. And some might be even keen to create an action plan for change. And that is significant as well. Let's see how folks are doing. I only see 238 people who have responded here. It's a quick exercise, so go ahead and complete that. I am curious to know how people might be engaged following the conversation that we have here. So just a couple more minutes for folks. And just looking at these results, it seems like a lot of you believe that you will share the knowledge that you've learned. Kudos to you, that's really good. Others believe that they will engage in self-reflection. So self-reflection is really good. But we want to make sure that that self-reflection becomes actionable. Okay, how will you use that information to bring about change? There's that application. Some of you plan to apply the strategies to your own practice. That's really good. We want to make systemic changes here. And that, you know, really be committed to continuous learning. So that's really important. So thank you, folks, for taking the time to complete this exercise. Certainly continue to enter your responses. And at this time, I will open things up for questions and comments. And thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Duhaney. And we do have some questions, and Annalie and I are going to present those, or some of them, to you now in our remaining time. The first one that we're going to share is the following. Some community legal centers in Ontario are working on projects that seek to address the unmet needs of folks experiencing gender-based violence or intimate partner violence in terms of legal supports and services. I wonder if you have thoughts on best practices for engaging Black community members with lived experience of gender-based violence or IPV in the needs assessment process in a way that is ethical, trauma-informed, and considers cultural safety when the person conducting the needs assessment is yet another white woman social worker?
That's a great question. And so the first thing I would say is, before any needs assessment is conducted, it's really important to conduct an environmental scan, so you really understand the population that you're trying to better understand. And as I mentioned in our conversation this afternoon, is you cannot simply conduct a needs assessment with a predominantly white group of people on populations that you really know very little about. So it's really important that you invite Black scholars, Black advocates, Black counselors to the table, right? And from different sectors as well, so that they can inform that, that dialogue and inform the information that you're documenting here, and even the collection, you know, and people collecting that information should also have that lived experience. I can't emphasize it enough. It does not mean that white frontline workers cannot do this work, but it's really important that we break down barriers. And if some women might feel more comfortable engaging with a person that they can self-identify with more, you know, do it. Do it to ensure that you can access this group of women. So just my initial thoughts on that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Duhaney. And I want to thank you for such an interactive and vibrant conversation as you've described it this afternoon. And you certainly generated lots of discussion in the chat. And so at one point during your second poll, the Slido question about, which resources do you believe Black women would have reached out to? There was some concern that you should have added spiritual support people such as pastors in that list. But I think there was relief at the end when you mentioned that religious and faith-based interventions should be explored and that might be relevant to Black women. But then again, at the same time, somebody else has commented that there's been a history of faith communities not always being safe spaces for women to disclose. So how do we reconcile all of this?
Yeah, so I certainly know the negative connotations attached with faith communities and the harm that has been done. However, some women who utilize these services might certainly still find it as a support. I agree that, pastors, religious, spiritual workers do need to do a better job of not telling women to stay in abusive relationship because God wants us to stay together. Yes, we need to do a better job of the messages that we give to women, because God did not tell anyone to stay in an abusive relationship. So I just want to put that out there. However, some women do find that those settings are very important for them to heal and work through challenges that they might be experiencing because of the gentler approach that they might utilize. So what I would say with that is certainly have that as an option to women who are open to utilizing those services, but not necessarily close the door because of our own preconceived notions of what those institutions stand for. Okay, I think women should be able to be provided with different options so that they can choose what best fits for them.
Thank you.
Dr. Duhaney, there were quite a few people who were wanting to know a little bit more about young Black women. And in particular, one question was, I have young Black women in my practice who continue to be shaped by the conventional cultural narrative that if he doesn't grip on me, then he doesn't care or love me. The language has shifted from men being handy to grip on me, and we must be mindful of the changes in youth culture and their language and experience of violence, and how this is linked also to TikTok and popular culture. Thoughts on how we as a community need to be mindful of such cultural shifts and shaping, and what we may best do in light of those?
Right. I must say that social media has made our world so much smaller, and I find that it's very difficult for older adults. And when I say older adults, I mean in people over 25, 30, it's very difficult for them to keep up because things are always changing. And so I think the first thing I would say, it's really important for young people to be cautious of social media, and what they put out there, right? You will get all sorts of information on social media, and I think we need to be critical of that. So that information that we share, and really utilize based on people's opinions that aren't even informed by anything in particular, except it's just their opinion. But I also think because social media has blown up so much recently, I believe as an organizations actually need to do a better job with utilizing those platforms to put positive messages, share positive messages to young people so that they actually know where to turn. So since we know that's a platform that young people are utilizing more often than other forms of supports, it's really important that we use those platforms in ways to engage young people.
Thank you.
Dr. Duhaney, another person is wondering, did your research note any trends regarding accessing IPV supports for Black women living with disabilities?
No, with the research I conducted, disability was not a key factor for these women. It was mostly immigration. Conversations around immigration came up a lot, and in terms of where they were born and so forth, that was more of a significant barrier, as well as economic marginality. Those were significant barriers as well. But certainly, as I'm conducting a larger study in Toronto and Calgary, that is certainly something I'll be looking into, to see the ways in which disability impacts Black women's experiences of domestic violence. And that I'm really excited about that study as well, because we'll be engaging Black men and actually ensuring that we create training opportunities for Black men to not only train other Black men, but go in their communities to impact change.
Along the same lines, Dr. Duhaney, there was a question about your study and whether it included women living in urban areas only, or whether it also included women living in rural areas. And if it did include both, were there differences that might be helpful for us to be aware of?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly we see that research shows us that women who are in rural areas are more isolated and more at risk of domestic violence. With my own research, I focused on, it was open to women across, the Greater Toronto area, for instance. However, I found that in terms of access, it was women who lived in larger metropolitan locations that were accessing the resources, or accessing the study, or even contacting me to be interviewed. And so from the research, we know that women who are in rural areas are certainly at risk. And so as a researcher, I know that we need to do a better job of conducting research that looks at the differential experiences within these women. And so it's another thing on my to-do list that I'll need to add to ensure that these women who tend to be more isolated certainly can access the supports they need as well.
Dr. Duhaney, you mentioned just before this that you were going to be doing some research in Ontario and in Calgary and with police. And so another question is, what would be helpful in terms of training and education of first responders or police, so that they might be better able to discern physical resistance versus other types of violence?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so just to let folks know, I recently worked with Calgary Police to help them in their own, they're in the process of developing their own anti-racism strategic plan. And so the way, it's really important for first responders to work with other organizations. I know there was certainly a discussion around ensuring that it's not just police officers who are called when we are dealing with mental health concerns. But I think we need to do a better job of ensuring that police officers are trained. And so, although I didn't focus too much on the results of my own study that looks at women's perceptions of the police and experiences of the police, what I found was that police officers, they're human beings, right? And just as human beings, they had their own negative perceptions of Black women, that they're more violent or they're more aggressive. And so they're more likely to be aggressive towards these women and think that they're more culpable of engaging in domestic violence. And so I would encourage police departments to do a better job of ensuring that officers have anti-Black racism training. They also have to have better training on learning to recognize the ways in which victimization and criminalization overlap, and actually listen to women, because that's another theme that came out in my own study, that women did not feel listened to. They actually called the police for help, and they themselves were arrested. Right. So they were re-victimized by a system that was supposed to protect them. So I think it's really important for there to be more training. A lot of the training that police officers are still receiving focuses on the dichotomy. They're either victims or they're offender, right? But not necessarily on the complexities of those two categorizations. So certainly training is necessary, but I also believe that organizations, police or services need, and first responders need to do a better job of, are there ways that we can utilize other supports as opposed to the police, so that people might be more responsive when they offer support, because of the distrust that exists and the harm that has happened in Black communities. People are distrustful of the police, and frankly, rightfully so, right? So I think the police departments need to do a better job of building trust in communities as well, even before they begin to engage on the front lines with Black communities.
Thank you.
Dr. Duhaney, there was a lot of interest in the concept of racial loyalty as a result of systemic racism that you described. And the question is, it seems like it would be really challenging to address this risk factor. And what are your suggestions for how we might begin to decrease this risk?
Mm-hmm. Yes, certainly racial loyalty. And I remember conducting this study and really having to unpack this in my own research. Certainly looking at racial loyalty is quite complex. It's not something that has just surfaced overnight. It has been around since slavery days, when slaves were whipped. They were abused by slave owners, and there had to be some sort of loyalty to different racial groups to protect each other. So the first step is have a conversation. Have a conversation with people who are accessing services, Black individuals who are accessing services, to see the ways in which racial loyalty might show up. Although it's a reoccurring theme in my research, as well as the research of other scholars, it doesn't mean that each Black person might feel the same way, right? Or have that same alignment. So it's really important as a starting point to have that conversation on a person-to-person basis. What is it that you need? What are some barriers that you're facing? How do you believe I can best support you, right? And that may come up. So I would say, don't even throw racial loyalty in the pot. Allow that conversation to flourish into whatever it needs to flourish into. And then maybe there might be a point where that is discussed. But I think it's really important for us to be careful of, putting words in our clients' mouths. We need to hear from them in terms of those experiences and what's relevant to them.
We're at the end of our Q&A, and in bringing this webinar to a close, I want to thank you, Dr. Patrina Duhaney, for your research, for the time that you took today to share this very informative presentation with us all. I'd like to also thank Dean and Christy from the Toronto Sign Language Interpreter Service, and Anna and Carla for the French interpretation during this webinar. I'd also like to remind you to make use of and share the resources sent to you this morning, and that were again posted in the chat box. I hope you'll join us on July 19th for the next Learning Network and Knowledge Hub webinar, The Supreme Court of Canada's Extreme Intoxication Decisions, Why Women Should Care, presented by Dr. Elizabeth Sheehy and Dr. Jacqueline Benjamin. With that, We thank you all for your participation and your engagement, and we hope to see you soon. Bye.